The horse tasted smoke first, a bitter tang on the wind, sharp against the dry dust of the plains. It unsettled him, made the animal shift and snort beneath the rider. He saw it second. Not flame, not yet, just a smear of bruised orange bleeding into the fading blue above the jagged line of hills. A stain spreading, too low for sunset, too angry. He rode on. The land here was sparse, unforgiving. Towns were blisters on the height of it, clinging to meager water and stubborn hope. Places easily erased, places to pass through without leaving tracks. That had always been the way. Keep moving, the dust his only wake. But the smell grew stronger, thick now, carrying the scent of pine burning hot and fast, the acrid smell of something more settled catching too. Structure, belonging, going up in smoke. His horse, a rangy roan mare with more sense than most men, pinned her ears. She felt the wrongness. He felt it too, a cold knot tightening low in his gut, familiar and unwelcome. Fire. He knew fire. Knew its hunger, its hollow roar that swallowed sound, its heat that peeled the world back to bone and char. He pulled his bandana higher, the rough cloth scratching against his jaw. The gesture was habit, old reflex. Protect the breath. He crested the final rise. Below, nestled in a shallow valley carved by a creek now likely choked with ash, was redemption. Or what was left of it. Flames clawed at the sky from the heart of the settlement. Buildings stood starkly against the inferno, skeletal timbers already collapsing inwards. Sparks rained down like malevolent hail, igniting dry grass, fence posts, anything that could burn. Tongues of fire licked at the edges of the valley, threatening to climb the slopes. A roar reached him now, not just of flames, but of panic, distant shouts, thin threads of sound nearly lost in the conflagration's throat. Shadows flitted between the burning structures, frantic, small. He should turn back. This wasn't his fight. His fights were internal. Shadows wrestled in the quiet, dark, not this raging, external beast. Nothing here for him but risk, nothing owed. Yet the mare fidgeted, sensing his tension, his stillness. He watched a roof sag, groan, and vanish in a geyser of sparks and smoke. A wave of heat washed over the rise, carrying the smell of terror. He thought of emptiness, the vast, echoing space inside him that travel couldn't fill, that silence couldn't soothe. Maybe emptiness wasn't the worst thing. Maybe watching, doing nothing, carved out something deeper, colder. He nudged the mare forward, not towards the panic scattering at the edges, but towards the burning heart, towards the roar, towards the end of something. Dust plumed behind them, a fading signature against the terrible glow. The air grew thick, tasting of soot. He could feel the heat on his face, tightening the skin around his eyes. The mare trembled but obeyed, her trust absolute, misplaced perhaps. He saw faces now, streaked with grime and tears, eyes wide with disbelief or dull with shock. They stumbled past, clutching meager bundles, dragging reluctant children, their movements jerky, uncoordinated. No one looked at him. They looked through him, their gaze fixed on escape or consumed by the inferno that had stolen their world. He rode deeper. The sound was immense, a physical pressure. Wood screamed as it yielded. Glass exploded, and underneath it all, a low, guttural rumble, the sound of the earth itself being consumed. He scanned the chaos, not looking for anything specific, just looking. An observer drawn to the precipice. Then, a flicker, not flame, movement, small, near a structure that still stood, somehow, though fire licked greedily at its porch. A lean-to, maybe, or a side room of the general store, its main roof already a jagged crown of fire. Trapped, hidden. He swung down from the mare, her reins held tight. "Stay," he murmured, the words swallowed instantly by the noise. He tied her loosely to a hitching post, miraculously untouched, hoping the radiated heat wouldn't spook her into breaking free. He moved towards the flicker, keeping low, using the dubious shelter of a water trough, its contents steaming, heat pressed in, relentless. His eyes stung, watering streams down his ash-caked cheeks. He saw her then, a small shape huddled in the narrow space between the store's sidewall and a stack of burning crates. A child, knees pulled to her chest, face buried. Her small shoulders shook. The fire crept closer, devouring the crates, spitting embers onto the rough wood of the wall behind her. He didn't call out. Words were useless here. He moved quickly, purposefully, covered the last few yards in lunging steps, the heat searing through his denims. He reached the space, the air thick enough to chew. He put a hand on her shoulder. She flinched violently, looking up, eyes wide, stark white, in a face smudged black with soot. Terror, pure, undiluted. No room for anything else. He didn't offer comfort, didn't know how. He simply put his hands under her arms, lifted. She was light, terrifyingly light, like a bird made of kindling. She didn't struggle, didn't make a sound beyond a sharp intake of breath that turned into a ragged cough. Smoke filled her small lungs. He turned, shielding her small body with his own as a section of the nearby roof collapsed inwards with a deafening crash, sending a shower of fiery debris raining down. He felt embers land on his back, his hat, stinging points of heat. He ignored them, moved back towards the mare, retracing his steps through the furnace air. Each breath was fire. Each step an effort against the suffocating heat. He reached the horse, untied the reins with fumbling fingers, swung himself up, pulling the girl onto the saddle in front of him, holding her tight against his chest, her face pressed against the rough fabric of his shirt. He could feel the frantic beat of her small heart against his ribs, or maybe it was his own. He turned the mare, urging her away from the inferno, back towards the relative cool of the slope, towards the stunned survivors, watching the destruction of their lives under a sky choked with smoke and grief. He rode out of the fire, the heat receding behind him, replaced by a chilling dampness clinging to his sweat-soaked clothes. The roar faded, leaving a ringing silence broken only by the horse's heavy breathing and the distant, ragged sounds of human sorrow. He carried her out of the flames, this small bundle of silence and soot. He didn't know her story, her family, her hopes. He only knew the fierce, fragile beat of her heart against his own, a counterpoint to the emptiness he carried inside. And then, a whisper, almost lost against his shirt, raw from smoke. Alara. Just the name. A single word plucked from the ashes. Alara. It hung in the air between them, heavy and fragile as smoke itself. He found a spot away from the main cluster of survivors, near a stand of pines the fire hadn't yet reached, though the air still tasted burnt. He slid off the mare first, then gently lifted the girl down. Alara. Her legs seemed unsteady, threatening to buckle. She stood there, small and lost against the vast, bruised backdrop of the smoldering valley. Her eyes, still wide, tracked his movements, but held a different quality now. Not just terror, exhaustion, shock, and something else. A dawning awareness of the figure who had pulled her from the heat. He checked her over. Small hands, face smudged beyond recognition, hair singed at the ends. Her dress, simple cotton, was torn and scorched at the hem. No obvious burns on her skin, just the angry red marks of heat exposure. He didn't speak. Words felt clumsy, inadequate. He moved to the mare, uncinching the saddlebags, pulled out his canteen, unscrewed the cap, the metal warm from the ambient heat. He knelt, offering it to her. She stared at the canteen, then up at his face, shadowed by his hat brim, impossible to read. Hesitantly, she reached out with a trembling hand, took it. Her fingers were tiny against the worn metal. She drank, small, ragged sips at first, then longer, deeper swallows. Water spilled, tracing clean paths through the soot on her chin. When she finished, she held the canteen out to him, her gaze unwavering. He took it, capped it, his movements economical. He looked back towards the town, or where the town had been. Pillars of smoke rose lazy and thick into the twilight air. Occasional bursts of flame still flared as hidden embers found new fuel. The sounds had changed. The roar was gone, replaced by the crackle and hiss of cooling debris, the groan of unstable timbers, and the low murmur of collective despair from the survivors huddled near the creek bed. Some were searching, calling out names that received no answer. Others simply sat, staring into the ruin. He saw suspicion in the few glances cast his way. A stranger, appearing from nowhere as their world ended. An ill omen, perhaps, or just another piece of driftwood caught in the flood. He offered no explanation, no reassurance. Let them think what they would. His concern, unexpectedly, was the small, silent figure beside him. Elara. She hadn't moved, just stood watching the smoke curl into the darkening sky. He took the bedroll from behind his saddle, shook it out. The rough wool smelled faintly of horse and dust, a familiar scent in the alien landscape of ash. He laid it on a patch of relatively clear ground beneath the pines. He gestured towards it, an invitation without words. She looked at the bedroll, then back at him. A flicker of understanding, or perhaps just obedience born of shock. She walked slowly, carefully, as if testing the solidity of the ground, and sat down on the edge of the wool blanket. She pulled her knees up to her chest again, wrapping her arms around them, making herself small. He took the mare a little further into the trees, loosened her cinch, let her graze on the sparse pine needles and dry grass the fire hadn't claimed. She deserved the rest. She'd carried them both through hell. He returned to the spot near the girl, sat down himself, not on the bedroll, but a few feet away, his back against the rough bark of a pine. He pulled his hat low, obscuring his face from her, from the world. Silence settled between them, thick and heavy as the smoke pall. It wasn't an empty silence. It vibrated with the echoes of the fire, with unspoken questions, with the sheer weight of what had happened. Night deepened. The orange glow from the valley floor softened, becoming a network of pulsing red veins in the darkness. The stars, usually brilliant in this high country, were hazed, veiled by the lingering smoke. He didn't sleep. He watched the embers, watched the slow shift of constellations through the haze, listened to the night sounds, the scuffle of some small creature in the undergrowth, the sigh of the wind in the pines, the occasional distant sob from the valley. Elara eventually succumbed to exhaustion. Her small body slumped sideways onto the bedroll, her breathing evening out, though shallow and occasionally hitched with a cough. Even in sleep, she seemed braced, coiled tight against unseen threats. He watched her, this child, Elara, a name without a face he could truly see beneath the grime, a life reduced to a single word whispered in smoke. He thought of other fires, other losses. Images flickered behind his eyes, unwelcome ghosts drawn by the scent of burning. A cabin, snow falling outside, thick and white. Inside, warmth, laughter. Then, the smell of lamp oil. A knocked-over lantern, flames erupting, swift, hungry, shouting, panic. A small hand slipping from his grasp in the blinding smoke. Futile searching. The roar, the heat. The collapse, the silence afterwards, colder than the snow. He closed his eyes, the memory scoring lines deeper into his face. He hadn't saved that hand, hadn't saved the one attached to it. He had run from the ashes, from the whispers, from the accusing silence of the snow-covered clearing. He ran until the running itself became the only thing he knew. Until now, until this fire. This child, Elara. He hadn't run this time. He'd ridden in, he'd reached into the smoke, he'd pulled her out. Why? Not redemption. The past couldn't be undone. The ghosts couldn't be laid to rest by saving another. Perhaps it was just instinct. Or perhaps, looking at the small, sleeping form on his bedroll, it was a flicker of something else, a recognition. Not of her, but of the chance, however small, to face the fire, internal and external, and not turn away, to stand sentinel in the ashes, just for a while. The night wore on, long and watchful. Dawn broke pale and uncertain, filtered through a sky still bruised with smoke. The air was cold, carrying the damp, sour smell of quenched fire and wet ash. Below, the valley was a monochrome landscape of gray and black, studded with the occasional stubborn ember glowing dully like a malevolent eye. Twisted metal, charred timbers, piles of unrecognizable debris, the bones of redemption picked clean. He rose stiffly, his muscles protesting the cold in the previous day's exertions. Small burns he hadn't noticed earlier stung on his hands and neck. Minor grievances. He checked the mare, gave her the last of the water from his canteen. She nudged his shoulder, a silent demand for grain he didn't have. He ran a hand down her neck, murmuring low words. Elara was awake, sitting up on the bedroll, watching him with those unsettlingly large eyes. The soot was thicker now in the daylight, a mask of tragedy. But beneath it, he could see the faint outline of her features. Young, so young. She didn't speak, didn't move towards him, just watched. He looked back towards the valley. Survivors were moving now, ghost-like figures picking through the ruins. Their movements were slow, dazed, searching for salvageable remnants, for lost loved ones, for answers that weren't there. He knew he should leave. Mount the mare, ride away from this desolation. Leave the girl with her own kind. Disappear back into the anonymity of the plains. That was the pattern. Arrive, observe, depart, never linger, never attach. But the image of her face, upturned in the firelight, the whisper of her name, held him fast. Leaving her here, now, felt like leaving a part of himself behind in the ashes. A part he hadn't known existed until he'd pulled her from the flames. He walked back towards her, stopping a few feet away. He hunkered down, meeting her gaze. Still no words. He reached into his saddlebag again, pulled out a piece of jerky, dried and tough. He held it out. She looked at the jerky, then at his hand, scarred, calloused, stained with soot. After a moment's hesitation that felt stretched thin as wire, she took it. Her small fingers brushed his, a fleeting contact, barely there, but it sent a strange jolt through him. She nibbled at the jerky, her small teeth struggling with the toughness, eating slowly, methodically, her eyes never leaving his face. He looked away, uncomfortable under the scrutiny. Scanned the tree line, the slope, the path leading away, escape routes, habit. His gaze snagged on something near the base of a scorched pine closer to the fire's edge. A splash of color against the gray. He walked towards it, a doll, raggedy, homemade. One button eye missing, the yarn hair singed, the simple calico dress blackened and stiff with soot along one side. It lay face down in the ash, abandoned in the flight. He picked it up gently, turned it over. Its painted smile seemed incongruous, almost mocking. Amidst the devastation, he carried it back towards Elara, knelt again, offered the doll without ceremony. Her eyes widened, almost imperceptibly. She dropped the half-eaten jerky, reached out with both hands, clutching the doll to her chest. She buried her face in its singed dress, her shoulders starting to shake again. Not the violent tremors of terror this time, but the deep, racking sobs of grief finally breaking through the shock. He stayed kneeling, silent, a reluctant witness. He didn't touch her, didn't offer empty platitudes. He just waited. Let the storm break. Let the tears fall, washing cleaner tracks through the soot on her face. He felt profoundly out of place, a rough stone thrown into a delicate mechanism. He knew horses, guns, the lay of the land, the language of silence and threat. He didn't know this, didn't know how to navigate the landscape of a child's sorrow. The crying subsided eventually, leaving her exhausted, hiccuping softly, clinging to the scorched doll as if it were the last solid thing in the universe. She looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed, glistening, a question in them. What now? He didn't have an answer. Not for her, not for himself. He stood up, rolled the bedroll, tied it behind his saddle, checked the mare's cinch. Routine actions. Grounding. He glanced back at Elara. She was watching him, the doll held tight. He hadn't decided anything, not consciously, but he didn't swing up onto the saddle. He didn't take the reins and lead the mare away. He just stood there, waiting. For what? He didn't know. Maybe for the sun to burn through the haze, maybe for a sign, maybe just for the quiet understanding that leaving wasn't an option. Not yet. He took a step towards the valley, towards the slow, painful work of sifting through the remains. He paused, looked back at her. a silent question of his own. Are you coming? She hesitated only a moment. Then, clutching the doll, she stood up on shaky legs and took a small step, then another, following him down the slope towards the ashes of redemption. The path ahead was uncertain, choked with debris and loss, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't walking it alone. The days bled into one another, marked by the slow clearing of debris and the gnawing ache of loss. He worked alongside the handful of remaining townsfolk, men and women hollowed by shock, moving with the grim determination of sheer survival. He said little, offered less in the way of comfort or explanation. His presence was an anomaly, a question mark hanging in the smoky air. But his hands were strong, his back tireless. He helped shore up the precarious walls of the livery stable, miraculously spared though scorched, helped clear the rubble from what was once the main street, searching for anything salvageable, anything whole. Found mostly fragments, splintered wood, melted glass, the twisted shapes of tools and household goods rendered unrecognizable by the heat. He worked methodically, his silence a stark contrast to the occasional bursts of grief or muttered curses from the others. They watched him, some with gratitude, seeing only the help offered, others with deep-seated suspicion. Who was he? Where did he come from? Why stay? He offered no answers. His past was a locked room. He kept the key hidden deep inside. He slept near the pines, away from the makeshift camp the survivors had established near the creek. Elara stayed near him. She rarely ventured far. Her world shrunk to the small radius around his quiet presence and the comforting weight of the scorched doll. She didn't speak his name. He hadn't offered one. He was simply him, the man who pulled her from the fire, the man who stayed. She watched him work, her large eyes absorbing his every move. Sometimes she would try to help in small ways, picking up tiny pieces of debris, her movements mirroring his own focused quiet. She found a handful of beads near the ashes of the mercantile, probably spilled from a broken necklace. One afternoon, while he sat resting, his back against the warm stone foundation of the ruined blacksmith shop, she approached him slowly, held out her small hand, palm up. On it lay 3 glass beads, one blue, one red, one chipped white. They shone dully against her soot-stained skin, an offering, a connection forged in silence. He looked at the beads, then into her waiting eyes. He hesitated, then gently closed her fingers over them. Yours, he murmured, the word rough from disuse. She clutched the beads tightly, then sat down near his feet, carefully arranging them on a flat piece of charred wood. A small moment of order in the chaos. He felt a shift inside him, subtle but definite, like ice cracking deep underwater. This child, this silent witness, was anchoring him here in a way he hadn't anticipated, hadn't wanted. It wasn't ownership, not responsibility in the way the world understood it. It was something quieter, more elemental, a shared breath in the aftermath. One evening, an older woman, Martha, whose face seemed carved from weathered wood and resilience, approached him as he tended the mare. Her eyes, sharp despite her age, missed nothing. She follows you like a shadow, Martha observed, her voice raspy. He didn't reply, just continued brushing down the roan's coat. Lost her, folks, I reckon. Martha continued, looking towards Elara, who sat near the fire pit the survivors used, clutching her doll. Her ma, Sarah, worked at the mercantile. Her pa. Well, he drifted through, like tumbleweed. She paused, her gaze returning to him. This town, it attracts tumbleweeds. And sometimes, fire. He met her gaze then, saw no accusation, just a weary understanding. Needs someone? Martha said simply. Even a shadow needs a place to fall. He still said nothing, but the weight of the unspoken settled between them. Martha nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself. Ashes make for fertile ground, they say. If the roots are strong enough. She turned and walked back towards the huddled group, leaving him alone with the horse, the dying light, and the weight of the child's gaze. That night, the dreams came again. Fire, smoke, the small hand slipping away. But this time, something was different. The face in the smoke wasn't the one from the cabin. It was Alara's, wide eyes searching for him through the haze. He woke with a start, the scent of phantom smoke sharp in his nostrils, his heart pounding. He looked over to where Alara slept on the bedroll, her small form curled around the doll. Safe. For now. He pushed the memories back down, locked the door again. But the lock felt looser now. The room less dark. He realized he hadn't thought about riding on. Not today. Not yesterday. The horizon still called, a siren song of anonymity. But the pull of the ashes, the weight of the small hand clutching 3 colored beads, held him here, a fragile root taking hold in broken ground. The rhythm of survival asserted itself. Slow, painful, but persistent. Water was drawn from the creek, carefully filtered. Salvaged tins of food were shared sparingly. Shelter was rudimentary, lean-tos built against the few standing walls, canvas stretched over frames of salvaged timber. The dead were buried in a quiet ceremony, marked by choked prayers and the stark finality of newly turned earth. Alara had no plot to stand beside. Martha confirmed her mother, Sarah, hadn't been found. Likely lost in the collapse of the mercantile. Her father remained a phantom, drifted away long before the fire came. She was utterly alone, save for him. He felt the weight of that solitude, a mirror to his own, though his was self-imposed. He continued his work, falling into the physical labor, as a way to quiet the noise inside his head, repairing a section of fence for the few surviving livestock, helping rig a pulley system to lift heavy beams. His competence with tools and his quiet strength earned him a grudging acceptance from most. The suspicion hadn't vanished, but it had softened, overlaid with the shared burden of rebuilding. He never offered his name. No one pressed him anymore. He was simply the stranger who stayed. Alara began to emerge from her shell of silence, tentatively. It wasn't a flood of words, but small sounds, gestures. A pointed finger towards a bird perched on a charred branch. A soft hum as she played with her beads and doll. One afternoon, he was trying to straighten a bent piece of metal, hammering it against a flat rock. The work was frustrating, the metal resisting. He struck it harder, a grunt escaping him. A small hand touched his arm. He stopped, looked down. Alara stood beside him, holding out a smooth, gray stone worn by water. She didn't speak, just offered it. He looked at the stone, then at her face. Understood. A worry stone. Something to hold, to ground the frustration. He took it, the stone cool against his calloused palm. He closed his fingers around it, felt its solidity, met her gaze. A flicker of a smile touched her lips, brief and uncertain as sunlight through smoke. It vanished as quickly as it came, but it left an afterimage, a warmth spreading through his chest. He slipped the stone into his pocket, went back to the metal, his movements less harsh now. Later, as dusk settled, casting long shadows across the ruined landscape, one of the men, Jedediah, a farmer whose hands were more used to soil than salvage, sat down beside him. Jedediah had lost his wife and barn, but his house, on the edge of town, had somehow survived. "You handle yourself well," Jedediah said, chewing on a piece of dried grass. "Know your way around tools. And trouble, I reckon." He didn't respond, just watched the fireflies beginning to blink near the creek. "Martha says you pulled the little one out," Jedediah continued. "Right from the heart of it." He nodded curtly, uncomfortable with the acknowledgement. "Takes nerve. Or desperation." Jedediah spat out the grass stem. "Which one is it for you, stranger?" The question hung there, direct, unavoidable. He turned his head slowly, met Jedediah's gaze. His eyes, usually guarded, held a depth of weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. He didn't offer his story, didn't explain the desperation that had driven him for years, the desperation to outrun memory. He simply looked towards Alara, who was carefully placing pine needles around her doll, creating a small nest. "Just seemed like the thing to do," he said, his voice low and gravelly. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was a truth. Jedediah studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the fading light. Then he nodded slowly. "Some things do." He stood up, brushed the dust from his pants. Winter's coming. Need all hands. If you're staying. It wasn't quite an invitation, not quite a plea. Just a statement of fact. The implication clear. Staying meant facing the questions, the scrutiny, the slow entanglement with the lives of these broken people. Leaving meant returning to the empty road, the ghosts his only companions. But leaving also meant leaving her, leaving Elara, to navigate the ashes alone. He felt the smooth stone in his pocket, its weight, a small anchor. He looked at Elara, absorbed in her quiet play, the firelight catching the faint dusting of gold in her singed hair. He thought of the hands slipping away in the smoke, the years of running. Maybe running wasn't the only way. Maybe standing still, facing the ruin, was its own kind of journey. He didn't answer Jedediah directly. But as the man walked away, he didn't turn his gaze back to the horizon. He kept watching the small girl and her doll, a silent guardian against the encroaching dark. The decision hadn't been spoken, but it settled in his bones, heavy and sure as the stone in his pocket. He was staying, for now, for her. The decision to stay wasn't marked by proclamation, but by the quiet continuity of his presence. He rose with the pale dawn, worked through the day, shared the meager evening meal near the communal fire, and watched over Elara as she slept. He became a fixture in the landscape of ruin and tentative recovery, familiar yet still unknown. His silence remained largely intact, but his actions wove him into the fabric of the struggling community. He helped Jedediah repair the roof of his surviving house, adding a small section onto the back, a place Elara could sleep, sheltered from the coming cold. He showed surprising skill in carpentry, his movements precise, economical. Where had he learned such things? No one asked. They accepted the help. Elara, too, settled into a new rhythm. She spent her days near him, a small, watchful presence. The haunted look in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a child's natural curiosity, albeit muted. She started exploring the edges of the camp, collecting interesting stones, feathers dropped by passing birds, twisted pieces of metal she arranged into patterns in the dust. She brought him her treasures, a hawk's feather, a shard of unbroken blue glass, a cluster of dried berries, each offering presented solemnly, received with a quiet nod or a gentle touch. Their communication remained largely nonverbal, a language built on shared space, observation, and these small rituals of connection. One crisp afternoon, as the first hints of autumn gold touched the leaves on the higher slopes, he was splitting salvaged wood for the winter stockpile. The rhythmic thud of the axe echoed in the quiet valley. Elara sat nearby, humming softly, dressing her doll in a scrap of cloth Martha had given her. He paused, leaning on the axe handle, wiping sweat from his brow with his forearm. He watched her concentration, the way her small brow furrowed as she tied the cloth. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Not the fire this time, something softer. A woman's hands, deft and sure, sewing a patch onto worn denim, laughter, low and warm, a shared glance across a rough-hewn table. The memory was fleeting, hazy around the edges, but it left an ache, a phantom limb of feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years. He pushed it away, focusing on the grain of the wood before him. But the ache lingered. He saw Martha approaching, carrying a steaming mug. She offered it to him. Weak chicory coffee, brewed over the open fire. He accepted it with a nod of thanks. "You're good with her," Martha said, gesturing towards Elara with her chin. Patient. He took a sip of the bitter brew. Didn't reply. "She needed someone," Martha continued, her gaze soft. "Someone solid. Even a silent man can be an anchor in a storm." She looked at him directly. "We all carry scars, stranger. Some on the outside, some deeper." He flinched inwardly at her perception, but his face remained impassive. He finished the coffee, handed the mug back. "Wood needs splitting," he said, turning back to his task. Martha watched him lift the axe, the muscles in his back coiling and releasing with practiced strength. She sighed softly. "Running only gets you so far. Eventually, you gotta stop, plant your feet, or the wind'll carry you away for good." She walked away, leaving her words hanging in the cool air. Plant your feet. The phrase echoed the feeling that had been growing inside him. This place, these people, this child, they were becoming an anchor, pulling him from the endless drift. Was it possible? Could roots truly grow in ashes? Could a man haunted by fire find a place to stand in its aftermath? He swung the axe, the blade biting deep into the wood. Each swing was a punctuation mark, a rhythm against the silence. He thought of Ilara's name, light, hope. He thought of the hand he couldn't hold. He thought of the small hand that now occasionally, tentatively, reached for his own when they walked through the ruins. He didn't know the future. Didn't know if redemption was possible, or even what it looked like. But as he worked under the vast, indifferent sky, with the silent girl watching him, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Not happiness, not peace, but purpose. A reason to plant his feet, right here, in the broken heart of redemption. A reason to face the coming winter. A reason to stay. The wind stirred the dust, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, washing away the last lingering traces of smoke. Winter announced itself not with a blizzard, but with a deepening chill that settled into the bones and turned the morning frost from lace to armor. The survivors huddled closer, their world shrinking to the few patched-up structures and the warmth of the communal fire. Jedediah's expanded house, rough but sturdy, became a central point, especially for Ilara. She slept in the small room he had built, a pallet bed near the hearth, the scorched doll and her collection of beads and stones arranged carefully beside it. He still slept apart, preferring the familiar solitude of the repaired livery stable, the scent of horse and hay a comfort. But his days were woven with the community, his evenings often spent near Jedediah's fire, sharing the quiet company. Ilara blossomed in small, quiet ways. She began speaking more, not long sentences, but observations, questions directed hesitantly towards him or Martha or Jedediah. Sky looks like snow. Horse needs water. Is that star lonely? Her voice was soft, still carrying a trace of smoke-induced raspiness, but it was sound, connection, life returning. She learned the names of the few remaining townsfolk, attached faces to the shared grief. She helped Martha sort salvaged beans, her small fingers surprisingly nimble. She followed Jedediah out to check snares, her steps light on the frosted ground, but her anchor remained the silent man. She sought him out constantly, content to sit near him while he worked, sharing the silence as comfortably as she now shared her tentative words. She'd learned his routines, knew when he checked the mare, when he sharpened tools, when he simply stood looking out at the stark landscape, his thoughts hidden behind his guarded expression. One afternoon, a supply wagon finally made it through the pass, bringing desperately needed flour, salt, blankets, and news from the outside world, news that seemed distant, irrelevant to the contained reality of Redemption Valley. With the supplies came a preacher, a well-meaning man with earnest eyes, determined to offer solace. He gathered the survivors, spoke of faith, loss, and rebuilding. He tried to draw the stranger into conversation, asking his name, his purpose. He received only polite deflection, quiet withdrawal. Later, the preacher approached Ilara as she sat tracing patterns in the frost on a window pane. "And who is that quiet man, child?" the preacher asked gently. "The one who watches over you?" Ilara looked towards the stable, where he was mending harness leather by the light filtering through the door. She thought for a moment, her brow furrowed. She didn't know his name. No one did. But she knew who he was. "He's the one who stayed," she said simply. The preacher looked puzzled but didn't press further. The description, stark and unadorned, felt profoundly true. He was the one who stayed, when he could have ridden away. When logic dictated flight, when his own history screamed for anonymity, he stayed. That evening, sitting by Jedediah's fire, the air sharp with cold, Ilara brought him something. Not a stone or a feather this time. It was a piece of charcoal from the hearth, and a relatively smooth piece of salvaged plank. She knelt before him, carefully drew a picture. A stick figure of a man, tall, wearing a hat. A smaller stick figure beside him, holding a lopsided circle, the doll. Above them, a crude rendition of the stable and Jedediah's house. And connecting the two figures, a wavering line drawn from hand to hand. She looked up at him, holding out the plank, her masterpiece. He took it, studied the simple drawing, saw the world through her eyes, saw himself not as the haunted drifter, the man running from ghosts, but as the figure who stood beside her, connected by that charcoal line. He felt something tighten in his throat. He looked at her, at the hopeful uncertainty in her eyes. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the smooth gray stone she had given him weeks ago. He pressed it gently into her palm, closing her small fingers around it. A shared talisman, a silent acknowledgement. "Thank you, Elara," he said, his voice rough. It was the first time he had spoken her name so directly, so softly, since the fire. Her eyes widened slightly, and a genuine smile, bright and unguarded, lit up her face. It was like seeing the sun break through after a long storm. In that moment, under the cold winter stars, surrounded by the remnants of destruction, something shifted definitively. The ghosts didn't vanish. The past wasn't erased. But they receded, pushed back by the undeniable weight of the present, by the reality of the small hand clutching a smooth stone, by the simple truth of a child's drawing on a piece of charred wood. He was the one who stayed, and perhaps, in staying, he was finally finding his way home. The heart of winter held the valley fast. Snow piled deep, muffling sound, isolating them further. Life became a cycle of conserving warmth, rationing food, and waiting. Waiting for the thaw, waiting for spring, waiting for a future that felt less like survival and more like living. He spent hours in the stable, caring for the mare, repairing equipment with meticulous slowness, the repetitive tasks a form of meditation. He found an old discarded ledger book, its pages mostly empty, and using charcoal began to sketch. Not people or places from his past. Those doors remained closed, but the details of the present. The intricate patterns of frost on the stable door, the way snow sculpted the ruins, Elara's doll propped against the wall, the mare's watchful eye, small things, grounding things. Elara often joined him, sitting quietly on a pile of hay, watching him draw or practicing the letters Martha was teaching her, scratching them onto scraps of wood. The silence between them was comfortable now, companionable. Sometimes she would ask about his drawings. Why draw the broken fence? Because, he'd answered after a pause, even broken things have a shape. One particularly cold evening, huddled near Jedediah's hearth, the wind howling outside like a hungry wolf, Martha was telling stories, old tales passed down, fragments of lives lived before the fire. She spoke of resilience, of families enduring hardship, of finding light in darkness. Elara listened intently, curled up on her pallet. He watched the firelight flicker across their faces, Martha's weathered calm, Jedediah's quiet endurance, Elara's absorbed innocence. These were the faces of redemption now, scarred, weary, but enduring. Later, after Elara had fallen asleep, Jedediah spoke, his voice low. "Spring comes, folks'll start thinking about moving on. Some already talk of it. Nothing left here for most." He looked at the stranger. "You?" He didn't hesitate this time. "Staying." Jedediah nodded, unsurprised. "She needs raising." It wasn't a question. "Needs a name to call you by," Jedediah added quietly. He stiffened slightly. A name was a tether, a history, something he had shed long ago. He looked over at Elara, sleeping peacefully, the firelight softening the lines of her face. She saw him not as a past, but as a present, as the one who stayed. Maybe that was enough. "She knows who I am," he said finally. Jedediah considered this. Maybe so, but the world likes names, labels, makes things fit. He shrugged. Just something to consider. The conversation lingered in his mind. A name. What name could he possibly claim? The ones from his past were buried in ash, associated with failure, with flight. Could he simply invent one? It felt dishonest. He had offered this child, this town, his hands, his presence, his silence. Offering a name felt like offering a ghost. Weeks passed. The grip of winter began to loosen. Patches of bare earth appeared beneath the receding snow. The creek swelled, its voice louder, more insistent. Signs of life returned. Birdsong. The first tentative green shoots pushing through the sodden ash. Hope, fragile but persistent. He found himself working alongside Jedediah more often, planning repairs, discussing rudimentary planting possibilities for the spring. He was becoming part of the planning, part of the tentative future. One afternoon, Elara ran towards him from the creek bed, her cheeks flushed with cold and excitement, her hands muddy. "Look!" She held out her closed fist. He knelt down. She opened her hand carefully. Inside lay a single, perfect arrowhead, chipped from dark flint, its edges still sharp. A remnant of people who had lived in this valley long before redemption was even a name. "From the before times," she whispered reverently, echoing Martha's stories. He examined the arrowhead. Smooth, symmetrical, crafted with purpose, a tool for survival, a link to the past, unearthed by the thaw. He looked at Elara, her eyes shining. "It's strong," he said. She nodded vigorously. "Like you." He felt that internal shift again, the deep cracking of ice. Her simple declaration, offered without artifice, struck him more profoundly than any accusation or question ever had. Strong, was he? He had always thought of himself as running, as weak in the face of his ghosts. But staying took a different kind of strength. Facing the ashes, internal and external, demanded a quiet fortitude he hadn't recognized in himself. He looked at the arrowhead again, then gently closed Elara's fingers around it, just as he had with the beads, with the stone. "Keep it safe," he murmured. She clutched it tightly. "I found it for you," she said. "So you remember." "Remember what?" he almost asked. But looking into her clear gaze, he understood. "Remember this place. Remember her. Remember the strength found not in fleeing but in standing still, in staying." He didn't need a name from the past. His identity wasn't anchored there anymore. It was here. Forged in fire, tempered by winter, defined by the simple act of presence, reflected in the eyes of a child who saw not a stranger, but a protector, the one who stayed. Spring arrived not as a gentle unfolding, but as a raw, determined surge. The creek roared, washing away the last vestiges of soot near its banks. Greenery pushed through the scarred earth with improbable force. The air felt cleaner, lighter, carrying the scent of damp soil and new beginnings. The handful of survivors began the arduous task of planting small plots of beans, corn, squash, wrested from the reluctant ground near Jedediah's house. Hope was measured in seedlings, in the slow turning of the seasons. He worked the earth alongside Jedediah, the physical labor familiar, grounding. His hands, already calloused, grew tougher, stained with the dark, rich soil. He learned the rhythms of planting, the patience required. Elara was a constant presence, darting between tasks, carrying water in a small pail, chasing butterflies that dipped and soared over the burgeoning green. The trauma hadn't vanished. It lingered in her moments of sudden stillness, in the way she sometimes startled at loud noises. But joy was finding its way back in, tentative but real. She laughed now, a sound clear and bright as creek water running over stones. He found himself watching her, a quiet protectiveness settling deep within him. It wasn't the anxious fear of loss that had haunted him for years, but a steady, watchful care. He was her anchor, yes, but she was also becoming his, a reason to look forward, not back. He continued his charcoal sketches in the old ledger, capturing the slow transformation of the valley, the sharp angles of ruin softening under new growth, the determined set of Jedediah's jaw as he surveyed his fields, Elara asleep in a patch of sun, the doll beside her. He drew his own hands, tracing the lines, the scars, the ingrained dirt, hands that had once failed, now engaged in the slow work of building and tending. One day, Elara sat beside him as he sketched the outline of the mountains rimming the valley. "Are you drawing the way out?" she asked quietly. He paused, the charcoal hovering over the page. He looked at the lines defining the pass, the traditional escape route, the path he hadn't taken. "No," he said, his voice steady. He added detail to the valley floor, the small cluster of buildings, the fields, drawing the way in. She considered this, then nodded, seemingly satisfied. She picked up a piece of charcoal herself, began drawing on another page. A horse, unmistakably his roan mare, strong and sturdy. He watched her, a quiet understanding passing between them. The focus wasn't escape anymore. It was here, this place, this life patched together from remnants. As the days warmed, travelers began to pass through the valley again, tentative trickles at first. Traders, prospectors, families seeking new starts further west. They brought news, goods, and curious glances at the small, struggling settlement. Some asked questions about the fire, about the stranger who seemed rooted here now. Martha or Jedediah would offer brief, non-committal answers. The stranger kept his distance, his silence a polite barrier. He felt no urge to join the westward flow, no pull towards the anonymity he once craved. His place was here, in the quiet rhythm of recovery. One evening, sitting outside the stable, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of rose and gold, colors no longer signifying destruction but beauty, Alara came and sat beside him. She leaned her head against his arm, a gesture of easy familiarity that would have been unthinkable months ago. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the stars emerge one by one in the clear, darkening sky. "Do stars have names?" she asked eventually. "Some do," he replied. "Sailors use them to find their way. People tell stories about them. Do you have a name?" The question was soft, almost hesitant, but direct. It wasn't the first time she'd skirted the issue, but it was the first time she'd asked so plainly. He didn't answer immediately. He looked up at the vast expanse, the scattered points of light. He thought of the past, the names he'd carried, the man he used to be. He thought of the fire, the running, the emptiness. Then he looked down at the small girl leaning against him, her trust absolute. She didn't need a name from a life he'd abandoned. She needed the man who sat beside her now, the one who stayed. "You can call me Silas," he said. The name came unexpectedly, dredged from some deep, forgotten corner of himself. It wasn't the name tied to the fire, to the failure. It was older, simpler, just a name. Solid, grounded, like the stone in his pocket. Alara looked up at him, testing the sound. "Silas." She smiled, a slow, trusting smile. "I like that name." She leaned her head back against his arm, content. Silas. It felt strange on his own ears, yet right. A name for the man he was becoming, here in the ashes. A name to plant roots with. He looked out at the valley, bathed in the soft light of the rising moon. It was still scarred, still rebuilding, but it was home. Not a place he'd sought, but a place that had claimed him, quietly, insistently. A place where a man named Silas could perhaps, finally, stop running. Life settled into the cadence of seasons. Summer brought heat, growth, the relentless work of tending the small crops and reinforcing structures against future hardships. Autumn painted the valley in gold and russet, a time for harvesting the meager bounty and preparing for the inevitable return of cold. Winter locked them in again, but this time felt different. Less like a siege, more like a quiet hibernation, a time for shared stories around the hearth, for planning, for strengthening the bonds forged in adversity. Silas, as he was now known to the small community, remained a man of few words, but his silence was no longer seen as evasion or threat. It was simply his way. His actions spoke with quiet authority, his skill with repairs, his knowledge of the land, his steady presence. He was woven into the fabric of redemption's tentative rebirth. He and Jedediah worked together seamlessly, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Martha relied on his strength and quiet judgment. The few other remaining families treated him as one of their own. The initial suspicion long faded, replaced by acceptance. His deepest connection remained with Alara. She was growing, shedding the last traces of the traumatized waif he'd pulled from the flames. Laughter came more easily to her now. She absorbed knowledge like dry ground soaking up rain, learning her letters from Martha, chores from Jedediah, and a quiet language of observation and resilience from Silas himself. She rarely spoke of the fire anymore, but sometimes, in the deep quiet of the night, Silas would hear her murmur in her sleep, her hand clutching the scorched doll. The past was part of her, as it was part of him, but it no longer defined her waking hours. He taught her things he hadn't realized he knew: how to read the weather in the clouds, how to track animals by their prints in the dust or snow, how to identify useful plants, how to be patient, watchful, attuned to the subtle shifts of the natural world. In turn, she taught him other things: how to accept kindness without suspicion, how to find wonder in small details, the iridescence of a beetle's wing, the intricate pattern of a snowflake, the warmth of sunlight after a storm, how to let down his guard, just a little, enough to let the light in. His charcoal sketches filled the old ledger. They were a record not just of the valley's recovery, but of his own. The lines became less stark, the shadows less consuming. He began to draw Ilara smiling, Jedediah laughing, Martha surveying her small herb garden. He even sketched himself once, reflected dimly in the creek water. A man weathered, scarred, but no longer haunted. Just present, grounded. One spring morning, almost 2 years after the fire, a circuit judge rode into the valley, accompanied by a clerk. They came to check on the settlement, record claims, establish some semblance of formal order. The judge, a stern man named Hawthorne, convened a meeting in the partially rebuilt shell of the Mercantile. He asked questions, took notes, his gaze sharp and assessing. He inquired about the fire, the losses, the plans for rebuilding. Then his attention turned to Silas and Ilara. "And the girl?" Judge Hawthorne asked, looking at Ilara, who stood near Silas, her hand instinctively finding his. "Her parents perished?" Martha stepped forward. "Her mother, Sarah, yes, in the fire. Her father, long gone." "And you, sir?" Hawthorne directed his gaze at Silas. "Your name?" "Silas," he answered calmly. "And your relation to the child?" The question hung in the air. He wasn't her father, uncle, cousin. He was the stranger who stayed, the man who had pulled her from the fire and simply never left. He looked down at Ilara, who watched him with trusting eyes. "I care for her," Silas said, the simple statement holding more weight than any legal term. "He's Silas," Ilara piped up, her voice clear. "He stays with me." Judge Hawthorne looked from the man's steady gaze to the girl's unwavering one. He saw the rough clothes, the calloused hands, the quiet protectiveness. He saw the bond, unspoken but undeniable. He consulted his notes, dipped his pen in ink. "Guardianship seems de facto," he murmured, more to his clerk than anyone else. He made a notation. "Silas," he said, looking up, "you intend to remain here? Provide for the child?" "Yes," Silas said, without hesitation. The judge nodded slowly, a flicker of something almost like respect in his stern eyes. "Very well. The court recognizes your role. See that she's cared for." Formalities concluded, the judge and his clerk eventually rode out, leaving the valley to its quiet rhythms. Nothing had legally changed, perhaps, but something felt cemented, acknowledged. Silas looked down at Ilara. She smiled up at him, relief clear on her face. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. He had ridden into redemption seeking nothing, expecting nothing. He had found ashes, loss, and a reason to stop running. He had found a scorched doll, 3 colored beads, a smooth gray stone, an arrowhead. He had found a name he could live with. He had found a child who needed someone to stay. And in staying, he had found something that felt remarkably like home. The sun warmed the valley, promising another season of growth. Silas stood with Ilara, watching the distant figures of the judge and clerk disappear over the rise. He wasn't looking towards the horizon as an escape route anymore. He was looking at it as the edge of their world, the one they were building together, here, in the heart of the ashes. So the story unfolds. not in grand pronouncements or sudden revelations, but in the quiet accretion of days, the steady rhythm of seasons. A man finds his footing, not by conquering the past, but by planting himself firmly in the present, tending to the fragile life entrusted to his care. A child finds shelter not just from the elements, but from the storm of loss, in the steady presence of unexpected kindness. Redemption, it turns out, is not a place you arrive at, but a path you walk, sometimes through ashes, towards the slow dawn of hope. You who have watched this unfold, perhaps you see the echoes in your own landscapes, the places where ruin met resilience, where silence spoke volumes, where the simple act of staying became the most profound journey of all. For in the end, growth often begins where destruction left its mark, and the deepest roots can anchor themselves in the most broken ground.